Hello viewers, this video covers an important topic of human body concerned with the tracts or pathways within our spinal cord which carry information from and to the brain. The information carried includes the various sensory signals to the brain and signals for the movement of different parts of the body from the brain. The spinal cord white matter has numerous groups of nerve fibers going towards and coming from the brain. These have been collectively called the ascending, demonstrated in green, and descending tracts, demonstrated in red, of the spinal cord respectively. The tracts are responsible for carrying sensory and motor stimuli to and from the periphery respectively. Ascending tracts are found in all columns, whereas descending tracts are found only in the lateral and the anterior columns. The descending tracts originate from different cortical areas and from brain stem nuclei. The descending pathway carry information associated with maintenance of motor activities such as posture, balance, muscle tone, and visceral and somatic reflex activity. The demonstrated transverse section of the spinal cord has been taken at a lower level than the part where decussation or crossing over of tracts takes place, that is, the upper spinal level. The spinal cord is elliptical in cross section, being compressed dorsolaterally. A transverse section of the adult spinal cord shows white matter in the periphery containing sensory and motor axons. The grey matter inside contains the nerve cell bodies arranged in the three grey columns that give the region its butterfly shape. Grey matter is distinguished from white matter in that it contains numerous cell bodies and relatively few myelinated axons, while white matter contains relatively few cell bodies and is composed chiefly of long-range myelinated axons. The color difference arises mainly from the whiteness of myelin. The white matter is divided into the following regions: dorsal or posterior column, also called the funiculus, lateral column, and the ventral column, also called the anterior column. The anterior white commissure resides in the center of the spinal cord, and it contains crossing nerve fibers that belong to the spinothalamic tracts, spinocerebellar tracts, and anterior corticospinal tracts. The anterior funiculus is limited medially by the ventromedian sulcus and laterally by the ventrolateral sulcus. Anterior tracts includes tectospinal, reticulospinal, vestibulospinal, and the ventral corticospinal tracts. The tectospinal tract coordinates movement of head, neck, and eyeball based on stimulus. Ventral corticospinal tract mediates balance and postural movements. The lateral funiculus is limited ventrally and dorsally by the ventrolateral and dorsolateral sulci. These include the lateral corticospinal tract, lateral vestibulospinal tract, and the rubrospinal tracts, located in the lateral funiculus or lateral column. Anterior and lateral corticospinal tracts convey skilled voluntary movements. Rubrospinal tract facilitates flexor and inhibits extensors. Vestibulospinal tract facilitates extensor and inhibits flexor. The posterior funiculus is located lateral to the dorsal median sulcus and medial to the dorsolateral sulcus. The nerve fibers comprising the ascending tract emerge from the first order neuron located in the dorsal root ganglia. The ascending tracts transmit sensory information from the sensory receptors to higher levels of the CNS. The ascending gracile and cunate fasciculi occupy the dorsal column and are sometimes named the dorsal funiculus. These fibers carry information related to fine touch, tactile stereognosis, 2-point discrimination of simultaneously applied pressure, vibration, position, and movement sense and conscious proprioception. Axons entering the spinal cord in the sacral region are found in the dorsal column near the midline and comprise the fasciculus gracilis, whereas axons that enter at higher levels are added in lateral positions and comprise the fasciculus cunatus. This orderly representation is termed somatotopic representation. In the lateral funiculus, the lateral spinothalamic tract carries pain, temperature, and crude touch information from somatic and visceral structures. Nearby laterally, the dorsal and the ventrospinocerebellar tracts carry unconscious proprioception information from muscles and joints of lower extremity to the cerebellum. Surrounding the ependymal layer of the central canal is the grey matter, a region containing cell bodies of neurons. It is shaped like the letter H or a butterfly. The two wings of the butterfly are connected across the midline by dorsal grey commissure. The shape and size of the grey matter varies according to the spinal cord level. At the lower levels, the ratio between the grey matter and the white matter is greater than in higher levels, mainly because lower levels contain less ascending and descending nerve fibers. The grey matter in the spinal cord is split into three grey columns. The anterior grey column contains motor neurons. These synapse with interneurons and axons of cells that have traveled down the pyramidal tract. These cells are responsible for movement of muscles. The lateral grey column contains neurons that innervates visceral and pelvic organs. The posterior grey column contains the points where sensory neurons synapse. These receive sensory information from the body, including fine touch, proprioception, and vibration. This information is then transmitted in axons up the spinal cord in spinal tracts, including the dorsal column or the medial meniscus and the spinothalamic tract, that terminate rostally in the brainstem, cerebellum. Still, other column cells send their axons across the midline to terminate in grey matter close to their origin and are called commissure association column cells. The proprio spinal cells are spinal interneurons whose axons do not leave the spinal cord proper. Proprio spinal cells account for about 90% of spinal neurons. Some of these fibers also are found around the margin of the gray matter of the cord and are collectively called the fasciculus proprius or proprio-spinal or the archi-spinothalamic tract. From dorsal horn, dorsal root arises, which further give rise to dorsal root ganglia. And from ventral horn, ventral root arises, and finally both the dorsal and ventral root merges with each other and form nerve of the respective region. Going into the details of the dorsal root, information from the skin, skeletal muscle, and joint is relayed to the spinal cord by the sensory cells located in the dorsal root ganglia. The dorsal root fibers are the axons originated from the primary sensory dorsal root ganglion cells. Each ascending dorsal root axon, before reaching the spinal cord, bifurcates into ascending and descending branches, entering several segments below and above their own segment. The ascending dorsal root fibers and the descending ventral root fibers from and to discrete areas form a spinal nerve. There are 31 paired spinal nerves. The dorsal root fibers segregate into lateral and medial divisions. The lateral division contains most of the unmyelinated and small myelinated axons carrying pain and temperature information to be terminated in the rexed laminae 1, 2, and 4 of the gray matter. The medial division of dorsal root fibers consists mainly of myelinated axons conducting sensory fibers from skin, muscles, and joints. It then enters the posterior or dorsal column or the funiculus and ascend in the dorsum column to be terminated in the ipsilateral nucleus gracilis or nucleus cuneatus at the medulla oblongata region. The axons of the first order primary sensory neurons synapse in the medulla oblongata. It enters the dorsal posterior column and ascend in the dorsal column to be terminated in the ipsilateral nucleus gracilis or nucleus cuneatus at the medulla oblongata region. That is, the axons of the first order primary sensory neurons synapse in the medulla oblongata on the second order secondary neurons in the nucleus gracilis or nucleus cuneatus. Discussing about the details of the ventral root, the ventral root fibers are the axons of motor and visceral afferent fibers and emerge from poorly defined ventral lateral sulcus as ventral rootlets. The ventral rootlets from discrete spinal cord sections unite and form the ventral root, which contain motor nerve axons from motor and visceral motor neurons. The alpha motor nerve axons innervate the extrafusal muscle fibers, while the small gamma motor neurons axons innervate the intrafusal muscle fibers located within the muscle spindles. The visceral neurons send preganglionic fibers to innervate the visceral organs. All these fibers join the dorsal root fibers distal to the dorsal root ganglia to form the spinal nerve. You can see the spinal vessels in this view. Two prominent grooves or sulci run along the length of the spinal cord. The anterior median fissure is the groove in the ventral side and the posterior median sulcus is the groove in the dorsal side. The anterior funiculus is limited medially by the ventral median sulcus and laterally by the ventrolateral sulcus. The spinal cord and the brain are protected by three layers of tissue or membranes called meninges that surround the canal. The delicate pia mater, that is the innermost protective layer, and is tightly associated with the surface of the spinal cord. The second is the arachnoid mater, which is the middle protective layer, named for its open spider web like appearance. The space between the arachnoid and the underlying pia mater is called the subarachnoid space. The subarachnoid space contains cerebrospinal fluid, which can be sampled with a lumbar puncture or spinal tap procedure. The dura mater is the outermost layer and it forms a tough protective coating. Between the dura mater and the surrounding bone of the vertebra is a space called the epidural space. The epidural space is filled with adipose tissue and it contains a network of blood vessels. Three general nerve fibers can be distinguished in the spinal cord white matter. Number 1. Long ascending nerve fibers originally from the column cells, which make synaptic connections to the neurons in various brainstem nuclei, cerebellum, and dorsal thalamus. Second, the long descending nerve fibers originating from cerebral cortex and various brainstem nuclei to synapse within the different rest layers in the spinal cord gray matter. And lastly, the shorter nerve fibers interconnecting various spinal cord levels, such as the fibers responsible for coordination of flexor reflexes.